So welcome back. So Lynn, I have a question. The bond as a relationship between us and our environment has turned the theory of evolution on its head. Can you tell us why that is?
Sure. I mean, again, we are imbued with the idea that we are meant to be competitive. And a lot of this comes from the work of Charles Darwin.
Hmm.
And what we believe was his term called, which is survival of the fittest.
Right.
He actually never said that. That was a term coined by a friend of his who was trying to promote Darwin's work.
A
Um,
marketer, of course.
a marketer, exactly, an
Puts a
internet
spin on it.
marketer at the time. But absolutely, and he wanted to market his work. Nevertheless, the idea caught fire, and thanks to the advent of mass printing at the time, his ideas swept the globe, and they became a justifying principle for a lot of burgeoning movements, including industrialized capitalism, which was just going on at the time,
Right.
and also colonialization, the idea that certain races were superior than others, and finally even sociopathic behavior, because of course Hitler loved Darwin, and eugenicists, people who believed that certain races should be killed off, people who had mental issues or Down syndrome people, things like that, should be killed. So people all found fruit in Darwin's work, those people of that ilk. But the point was, this became part of the zeitgeist of the time and has really prevailed ever since. And it's also been given some wind by the ideas of Adam Smith, who had always said, we do best as society by looking out for number one. And that has been something we've always, we've believed in modern society. We think that this is what propels society forward. But we're now discovering that that's completely not true. That nature, and actually Darwin came back to this later in his life and talked a lot more about cooperation. And
Mm.
many societies rejected Darwin's ideas. I mean, the Russians believed in an idea called mutual aid and believed that, this idea of competitive individualism was wrong. And certainly we see this with vast bodies of evidence that human beings, we were meant to share, care, and be fair, basically. That we find it really difficult to be, we were born to give, we were born to be fair, we were born to essentially be alike. We're incredibly imitative, and we were born to, to be part of a bigger whole. When we're not, we get ill.
Very true. One of the things that I think Facebook is just wonderful for is showing us all different types of videos and clips that people have captured of animals doing interesting things. Like there was a cat that was actually a mother cat that was feeding baby hamsters and all kinds of things like that, which totally fly in the face of the fact that animals are, the thing that we look at for competition, that they wouldn't take care of each other or that they didn't nurture each other, which is absolutely so not true. So that kind of backs up exactly what you're saying.
Absolutely. We believe that animals are inherently cruel and self-serving. Absolutely. I mean, there's animals routinely adopt other animals. I mean, just as you said, that there are incredible stories and also studies demonstrating just that fact. And that animals, we always think of them as heartless and just totally self-serving.
Yeah.
And there can be some rituals in some kinds of animal populations that would seem kind of cruel to us when we look at alpha males, et cetera, et cetera. But in the majority of instances, animals are looking after each other an awful lot, and animals have a much more of an idea of the herd than human beings do, actually. So, but when you look at, evidence on humans too, I mean, just a few things, we were actually programmed to feel as good about giving to others as eating or having sex. So, and we have a thing called the vagus nerve, which is the nerve that kind of connects so many of our organs and our spine. And that releases oxytocin, when we get involved in a charitable act. But I think the thing that has spoken to me most about how we were designed to be part of a greater whole and to give, there was a really intriguing study I just came across showing, it was comparing people who live a pleasurable life, you know, the kind of life we think is really fulfilling, the good life, you know, good job, lots of holidays, all of that stuff, you know, and lots of money. And they compared that to people who lived a life of purpose and meaning. And they found that the people who, neither group suffered from depression, but the people who lived a pleasurable life had huge inflammatory markers. Something was going awry in their bodies, and they were big candidates for getting ill. Whereas the people who lived a life of purpose, not necessarily as affluent a life, but a life of purpose and meaning, had very low markers for inflammation. So something about being part of an altruistic bigger whole and living a life of meaning was much more important to them.
Very interesting. Mm-hmm. You know, in your book, you talked about that, and I really find this intriguing, is the idea that of the individualism that we grew up with in the West versus East, like you in your book, you talk about East Asian culture. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the difference in that. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I really think that it's especially for us in the West, like you just talked about how people that are successful have inflammatory disease and all sorts of interesting things. Can you talk about that versus East Asian cultures and how they see the world and how that affects them?
Sure. One of the problems we have is that we in the West have been taught to see with real blinkered eyes. You know, part of our culture of competitive individualism is learning to see just, you know, about I. And so let's take an example. Imagine we've got two students. One is Japanese and one is American, and they're standing in front of the most famous painting in the world, you know, the Mona Lisa. Mm-hmm. And so if it were the American student, the way he sees the picture is just this. He sees the face. In fact, he probably focuses on the very epicenter of the painting, the eyes. The Japanese student sees something very different. To him, the figure almost shrinks so that it's just part of that big and very complex background that was painted. And he sees it as part of a, you know, interpenetrated whole. And that's the way the Japanese and versus the Americans have been brought up to see. You know, Americans, when we were brought up, and this is really most Westerners, we're brought up to look at, you know, think about the books we start reading. Americans read, if they're my age, they've started reading with books that were called Fun with Dick and Jane.
I remember those.
I don't remember those.
I do.
There you go. And they're all about the comings and goings of individuals, you know, see, spot, run.
Yeah.
Or, you know, run, Dick, run. Japanese children are brought up with very different kinds of books. They'll be brought up with a book that reads something like this. You know, Big Brother is sitting with Little Brother. Little Brother loves Big Brother. Big Brother looks after Little Brother. So they're taught about the idea of relationship from a very young age. And that starts governing how they see. They've realized that people from the East, Japanese cultures, Chinese cultures, are taught to look much more carefully about everything and see it as a whole. Their eyes actually move a lot faster than ours to take in a whole scene. And when they've done scientific studies on them, they realize they pick up far more than we do. So they're seeing things as a whole. Whereas, as I say, we're taught to look for the thing, you know, the point of the story, the individual. And that governs, as I say, how we see everything in life.
But where's Waldo? So we're keying in on this one thing.
Yeah, exactly. And we miss everything. We miss the forest for the tree.
Yeah, I missed the forest for the tree when I went and saw the Mona Lisa and looked at it and goes, that all there is? Because, you know, right? Because have you seen it in person?
Sure.
Yeah, it's like, what is it, like 10 by 12 or something? I mean, it's really small.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Well, it's been such a big buildup. We think of it as this
Right, exactly.
monumental. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, going back to the Japanese culture, because a lot of the Eastern cultures, they have their concept of family is a bigger unit than what we think of. I mean, it's not unusual for them to have 3-4 generations of people living together, and taking care of their elders as part of their consciousness. I mean, they don't have that idea that everybody lives their own lives. They kind of see themselves closer in contact with each other, interconnected. And,
Yes.
and it's that interconnection, I think, that you were speaking of in the bond, where energetically we're all connected anyway.
Well, and I think, yes, and the sooner we start living the way we were designed to live, the better off we're all going to be, in terms of our health, our well-being, our happiness, etc. I mean, we're living against nature. Now, you see that when you look at a little microcosm, which is the famous story of the Pennsylvania town called Roseto. Now, Roseto these were a group of transplanted Italians who had come from a similarly named town in Italy. And they all settled there. And they worked, and they were all pretty poor. They worked the mines there. They had pretty tough jobs, and they ate terrible food. It was covered with lard. It was only what they could afford.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, under the guidance of one of the priests there, they festooned their town with flowers. People of different incomes lived right next to each other, and they had this amazing feeling of community pride and purpose. And people lived with several generations in the same town. And when some doctors were looking at their town, they suddenly realized there's no heart disease here. And this was compared to towns just surrounding them, where there was very high incidence of heart disease. So they started to try to tease out what was the X factor here that was keeping these people healthy. And they found it was this strong community spirit. And then when the subsequent generations started living more ordinary American lives, where they moved out from their extended families and they started moving out of the town, the heart attack risk started creeping up. And it became equivalent to the rest of America then. And they find that too with different transplanted populations, like the Japanese. Japanese confound epidemiologists, scientists who study populations, because they smoke like chimneys, but they don't get heart disease until they come to America. And when they do, some get heart disease equivalent to Americans, and others don't. So when scientists have looked further at this, they've discovered there's one big factor that determines it. And it has nothing to do with diet. Doesn't matter if they eat tofu and sushi or Big Macs and fries. The only thing that matters is whether they recreate the close community ties of the old country.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, once again, community is the best drug there is. And they've found, when the scientists who were stunned by this went to Japan to find out about this, the Japanese looked at them like they were crazy. Well, and they said, well, it's because you Americans, you're so lonely. You even walk down the street alone. Anybody can see this. So for them, our American lifestyle, it's lonely individualism, it's toxic. That's the thing that's toxic about it. That's the thing that's killing people.
It's fascinating. Now, it's time for a break, so let's just stop for a moment, and we'll be right back with Lynne McTaggart.